Hello, 92nd Street Y. Welcome to our conversation with Ira Chaleff about his new book, To Stop a Tyrant. My name is Max Klau, really honored and thrilled to be here to be in conversation with my friend and colleague Ira. A little bit about me. I'm a leadership consultant, coach, author, and speaker in Boston. I also serve as a senior advisor for the New Politics Leadership Academy, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is focused on recruiting and developing servant leaders to run for elected office. And for us, that meant military vets, alumni of national service programs like AmeriCorps or Peace Corps, and individuals who had pursued careers in education and healthcare, people who had clearly shown that they serve a cause larger than self. We wanted more of those folks in politics. And I was chief program officer there for 7 years and developed a pipeline of leadership development programs that have graduated thousands of servant leaders, many of whom are now in office at every level, from school board to Congress. And really an honor and a privilege to be here talking to my friend Ira, who has just released a brand new book called To Stop a Tyrant: The Power of Political Followers to Make or Break a Toxic Leader. And before we jump into our conversation, I just want to make sure you have a little deeper sense of who Ira is and all the amazing things he's accomplished. So Ira is an author, speaker, and executive coach in the greater Washington, D.C. area. His extensive experience with the U.S. federal government includes having directed and chaired the nonpartisan Congressional Management Foundation, where he is now Chair Emeritus. And that means Ira co-authored the original handbook that is given to every newly elected member of Congress. It's now in its 15th edition. And Ira has also facilitated over 100 retreats for congressional offices. He has led and participated in democracy strengthening programs in Asia and West Africa, and consulted for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Eastern Europe. He's been an adjunct faculty at the Federal Executive Institute and was a visiting leadership scholar at Churchill College in Cambridge University in England. He served 2 terms on the board of directors of the International Leadership Association, which is actually how Ira and I first met. I was on the board with him as well. And he's the founder of the followership community. His previous award-winning books include The Courageous Follower, Standing Up to and for Our Leaders, and also Intelligent Disobedience, Doing Right When What You Are Told to Do is Wrong, which has been published in translation in Beijing and in Moscow. Ira speaks on courageous followership and intelligent disobedience at a really wide range of institutions that include the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Naval Academy, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in the U.K., the European Commission of the EU, and many others. And again, we are here because he's just put out his newest book, published this month, To Stop a Tyrant: The Power of Political Followers to Make or Break a Toxic Leader. It's already been called a book that has met its time. Ira, welcome. So glad to have you here.
Thanks so much, Max. I couldn't be more delighted to be in conversation with you about this. You know, we're a bit of a rare breed in that each of us has worked with, directed programs that are nonpartisan to help improve our democracy. And as we know, these days, we could use more of that. So delighted that you are able to spend this time with me today. And I look forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. So let's start, before we get to the book, the background that has really fueled your interest in followership. Let's begin with just, where does your passion for this purpose come from?
Well, unfortunately, it's not a happy story, but it's one that I think many people listening to this podcast will understand. I grew up in a multi-generational family with my parents and maternal grandparents. My maternal grandmother lost her entire family in the Holocaust, except for one niece who she was able to buy her freedom before the borders closed. And it took me a while to understand what this was about. But when I did understand, it entered into me so deeply, I didn't even know what to do with it. I used to play a game of solitaire where I had to score as many points as I could, because each point saved another Jew from the gas chambers. That's how deeply it entered into me.
Yeah.
Now, what does a kid do with that? You don't even know what to do with that. And in those days, parents didn't have a much better idea of how to help you. But through the course of my life, this became almost an organizing question. how does that occur? Why do people follow a leader that is so destructive? And can we do anything about this human tendency? And that's for the last 30 plus years, that's what my work has been about.
Yeah, it's really organized your life.
Matt, I'm curious, do you have any similar background? I believe you grew up in an Ashkenazic family as
I
well.
do.
So
I'm Jewish as well. My family did come over before the Holocaust, but I do think I can say my passion for civic engagement and leadership comes from understanding, to be Jewish is to really see the depths of man's inhumanity to man, like what is possible, and to really live with that question of how does this happen, and how might we make sure it doesn't happen again. And I've also kind of arrived at this understanding of there's some interrelationship between the leader who is in charge and all the followers, and to understand that we can't just look to the great man and only focus on the person at the top. We have to take a wider view and understand we are in this kind of interdependent dance here. And so I do share a similar sense of deep motivation around we really need to understand how do we forge citizens who will resist this and
yeah,
will
exactly.
yeah
Resistance. That's exactly right, Max.
yeah. So your kind of professional existence has been around followership, and I'll be honest, I just love sitting and talking with you and hearing a little bit about what this work is and the impact it's had in the world. So just get a little more sense of kind of what is the followership work you've been doing, and a little bit about kind of how it's rippled out and some of the impact it's been having around the world.
Well, Max, about 40 years ago, I came to Washington, D.C., like thousands of people saying, how can I make a difference? And I found this little niche, which you already referenced, the Congressional Management Foundation, a nonprofit, nonpartisan, working with members of Congress and their staffs to help them do a better job serving their constituents. Well, this became an interesting informal laboratory for me because I would watch 20 something staff, 20 something year old staff with a member of Congress who was typically in their 40s, 50s, 60s. And how did they form a relationship in which they could influence the leader, the member of Congress? And some did it very well, and some failed to do that. And I realized that I was onto something here. So at some point, when I sort of the penny dropped, ooh, wait a second, this is followers of political leaders. What have I learned about that? What can I continue to ask questions about and learn more about? And what can I share with the world? And that became the process in which I wrote my first book, which became called The Courageous Follower, Standing Up to and for Our Leader. Must do both. If you only stand up to the leader, you will have to be pushed out because you're really competing for the leadership. If you only stand up for the leader, you're not of great value because you're not helping leaders see into their blind spots. So I found this book was an interesting, I like your expression, dance between how do you do that? How do you combine these two vectors, if you will? I was very, very fortunate because very little had been written on this. In fact, when I used to type in followership, spell check inevitably would change it to fellowship because the word wasn't current at all.
Yeah.
It was as if it was from a foreign language. Fortunately, that's really changed now. It's become understood that there is no leadership without followership.
Yeah, they go together
to each other. So that's how this journey began, and it's important, I think, to understand that it began intentionally in a political context.
Love it. And well, two questions for you. One is, you have this story about a nurse who is told by a doctor to administer an IV. That it's my favorite story you tell about like really bringing home the challenge of being a courageous follower. Would you mind just briefly giving us that tale to give a sense of the type of work that you're doing and the way you invite people to think about this?
It's a powerful story.
Yeah.
And it appears in my book, Intelligent Disobedience, Doing Right When What You're Told to Do is Wrong. I was teaching, as I have hundreds of times, a workshop on courageous following. And during the break, a woman came up to me and told me this story. And she said that she had been a young nurse, fresh out of nursing school, assigned to an emergency room. And a patient, a cardiac patient, was rushed in, and the attending physician quickly came over, quickly evaluated the patient, and ordered her to administer a drug which she had been taught was not the right drug for that situation and could have serious adverse consequences. Now, just you had to put yourself in her shoes for a moment. Here's a doctor, she's a nurse. In those days, of course, there were gender imbalances in that field as well. They're far less so, fortunately, now in that field. And she had to decide, well, what does she do? And she found the courage to say to the doctor, doctor, whatever his name was, I was taught that's not the right medication. Now he's harried, he's busy, and he just looked at her and he said, you just do what I say, and ran off. Now she's stuck with, does she risk her career by not doing what she's told? Does she risk the patient's life? What she did, and this is what floored me, and it floors most people who hear the story, why it's memorable. She set up the IV bag, she put in the medication that he ordered, she called him over and said, doctor, it's ready. All you have to do is turn the valve. My training says that that's not the right thing to do. So if you're sure, you'll need to do that. And that was enough for him to step back, reconsider, and prescribe a safer medication. So it had a very happy ending. But you see the courage,
right,
and the kind of the aplomb that was needed in that moment, because usually it is shocking, when you're told to do something that's not right, it's not ethical or just wrong.
I love that. I love that story for just how vividly it brings to life this challenge of, it's not, you don't have to just choose blind obedience and complete rebellion. Here's a way to partner and just like handle this situation that's so sensitive with such thoughtfulness. So thank you for sharing. And I hope it gives listeners a little more insight into the type of work that you do. And I also just love, you presented this to the entire British military, right? Like, to give a little sense of kind of the impact this has had. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I've been very fortunate, Max. Again, probably because there is so little written on the subject of followership. My work has found its way into almost all of the arenas, both in the US and internationally, that I hoped it would. People get surprised that you can even talk about disobedience in a military context. But in fact, the military have been one of the most avid adapters of these concepts. Why? Because lives are at stake, and they know that you can get a non-commissioned officer who has a lot more experience than a fresh out of the Naval Academy or West Point, and they need to be able to speak up and advise their senior officers, and the senior officers have to be wise enough to know this isn't insubordination. This is the right thing to do. So yes, and as a matter of fact, it's almost like a capstone. The British military at their Royal Academy, which is more or less the equivalent of West Point, have added to their leadership doctrine a followership doctrine. And it is a detailed doctrine, not of passive followership, but of courageous followership. And they have now made it a platform for all of their officers and all of their newly recruited military people. So I couldn't be more grateful and more full of admiration for what they're doing. in a way, my work now is say, okay, well, those are in some of the governing aspects of a culture,
Right.
but they're not the political aspects.
Okay.
So, so that's where this new work is going.
Great. That's exactly where I was going. So what got you to writing a book about stopping tyrants? How'd you get to this latest project?
In a way, I've been writing it my whole life, haven't I, Max?
Right. The theme is pretty clear, but it is kind of a different, a new framework, a new conceptual framework that builds on the things you've been doing. So what got you here?
I don't know, 15 years, maybe 20 years ago, I was conducting a seminar, giving a seminar at the University of Wisconsin Graduate School of Public Accounting. And I was talking about the background, which I shared already about the Holocaust. And then I was talking about the models in The Courageous Follower. And during the Q&A, a bright young person said, I get what you're trying to do, but I don't get, this is kind of written in a more or less business or government agency mode. I
Mm,
don't get how it's addressing the core issue that you are concerned about. And I just went, he's right.
good point. Good point.
So,
Hmm.
so um, the time emerged when I realized it is now time to take all of the experience that I've had. And I'm so fortunate, like you, Max, that I've been able to have nonpartisan but deep experience in how politics works, so that I could write a book that was not just sort of cheerleading for my side of the aisle, which, there are probably 100 books right now about how democracy dies, how tyrants
Yeah.
take over, the strong man, etc. Good books. But in a way, they're all speaking to the choir. And
Mm,
I wanted to write a book that could speak to anyone. In other words, like you, Max, when I worked for the Congressional Management Foundation, where I'm still Chair Emeritus, I never told people how to vote. What
right.
I did was work with their elected officials to make them better representatives of the people who could tell them how they would prefer them to vote. And that's the stance that I've taken in this book, which it took a lot of careful thought to not let unintended biases creep into this. So I had colleagues on both sides of the aisle read this
Mm,
carefully, because you don't know in your own language
sure.
biases can creep in. So I'm pretty confident now that I've achieved that goal. And frankly, it doesn't necessarily make people on either side of the aisle terrifically happy. People on the left say, why aren't you coming down on, who's running for office that I think is a tyrant? And people on the right go, well, why aren't you coming down on the deep state? And and I'm going, that's your job.
Yeah.
Followers have to choose their leaders, create their leaders, help their leaders go on better paths than worse paths. And my job in this book is to help you think through, first of all, what are the barriers to doing that, both within you and in society?
Right.
And then what are some of the ways you can transcend those barriers and perhaps make a difference?
Love that. We have walked related paths, and it would be so much easier. There have been so many times when it would just be so much easier to just pick a side and just say we are, you
Right.
know. But I know at New Politics, the idea was always this is about leadership and character. And that is not an inherently partisan thing. And at the deepest level, we need leadership and character across all different boundaries. And our, democracy is strongest when we're thoughtful about that and cultivating it in ways that aren't fundamentally about party and partisanship. So
That's right on the money.
yeah,
As you said, I facilitated about 100 closed door retreats for congressional offices. That would be the member and their staff, and that would be the Washington office and the home district office coming together. And I did it on both sides of the aisle. And I can tell you, without any reservation, there are people of great integrity and intelligence on both sides, and there are people on both sides who have made compromises that I do not think they will necessarily be proud of, when they look back on their lives, on their professional work. So character is really critical, and there are so many pressures. It is very, very difficult to be a politician in a democratic society. By its very nature, that democracies are about competing visions and competing interests. And so if you represent 1 million people, I can guarantee you that the number of different views you're going to be assaulted with to say, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to pay attention to.
Sure.
Somehow the individual representative has to find out where's the confluence between representing the majority of their people and their district's interests and their own sense of morality. And that's not the easiest confluence. So I'm a great advocate for not trashing our people who step up and do the difficult work of politics. Yes, some disappoint us, and some even, we find very distasteful. But on the whole, they are attempting to work within the democratic system to make a difference according to their own lights.
I appreciate that. I feel moved to share a little bit about how at New Politics, everything you're saying is why we began with inner work. Why it wasn't with here's how you run a campaign or here's how you get on the ballot. It began with who are you, what are your values, what do you care most deeply about? And we also talked a bit about shadow, like who are you when you don't live with integrity to your own values? Because everybody needs to be awake to that inner work so that when they step into these positions of power where there are all these people, all these forces, incredible pressures on them, they're able to navigate that with much more self-awareness and like the inner connection to their own North Star so that they can navigate that without losing themselves or becoming the kind of person they don't want to be. And the kind of person that so many of us look at as those are problematic politicians. So anyway,
that's terrific. And, so then if we take it to the follower perspective, which, is what I will keep doing. First of all, followers need to cut their leaders a bit of slack. In other words, there are no perfect leaders.
Right.
And there are no perfect parents. At times your parents disappoint you. At times we disappoint our children.
Yep.
There are no perfect leaders. And it's not fair, it's not mature to hold them up to that kind of a standard. And the pressures on them are enormous. The pressures to conform to party loyalty and to the White House calls up and says, I really need you on this one, and I won't forget if you just stretch a bit on this one. And those are enormous pressures, and they have to find that path between remaining an effective member, which requires compromise in a democracy. The only people who don't need to compromise are dictators.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what we don't want. So rather than kind of trash people for compromise, we have to realize this is a skill, it's an art, and they have to find that way, as you say, between how do they do it while staying as true to themselves as they can, while also working in the real world about what's possible. So in this book, what I'm doing is trying to help us as followers, depending on where we are in relation to the leader, recognize the pressures on us that are kind of concomitant with the pressures on them, and how we deal with those, and then do the best we can to help create the best leadership they can give us.
Love it. Love the sense of kind of empathy and grace for everybody in this system, which it's actually very challenging to be both a courageous follower and an effective leader, and to hold all of it with some deeper grace is just a beautiful idea. So I do want to jump into the ideas of your book, which I just think are brilliant and important. But just to contextualize it in the moment, there are anti-democratic forces on the rise around the world. This is not just something going on in the US. You've spent years studying this phenomenon of followership. And I have to ask, kind of how do you understand what is happening? What are the forces driving this trend that is clearly a global dynamic right now?
So, Max, when people heard what I was writing about in the title of my book, inevitably they said, "Boy, is that timely."
Yeah.
And my response was always, "Yes, it is timely." And it has been timely throughout human history.
Yeah, timely and
and in
timeless.
every
Yeah.
single continent. So there's something in the human condition. And I go into this somewhat, but rather than be theoretical and try to understand or create some sort of theoretical framework, my books are about what we can do
Yes.
with the reality that we're faced with. What's possible? How can we mitigate this? I'd love to be able to tell you this book will tell you how to transform this, but it doesn't. We don't know how to do that yet. But we do know and should know how we can mitigate it and curb the worst excesses of this, and at times, prevent real tragedies. That's what I hope each reader gets from this book.
Yeah, one of the things I love about it is just how incredibly practical and kind of grounded in reality everything is. So let's get there. One of the ideas from your book, To Stop a Tyrant, is to be really clear. Tyrants don't just appear instantly, fully formed. There is a process and kind of a timeline over which they accumulate power and kind of get closer and closer to their ability to implement their vision. Tell us a little bit about that process and how we need to think about that.
Yeah, one of the contributions of this book is I've given a name to that. I don't usually favor inventing words, but this word is so close to ordinary English that it seems to work. Nobody seems to have a problem with it. And the word is proto-tyrant.
Tell us
So,
about proto-tyrants. I love it.
yeah,
What does
it's
that
like
mean?
prototype. What's a prototype? A prototype is an early version of a later type. So even though the book is called To Stop a Tyrant, you can't actually stop a tyrant through normal political means. Once they are a tyrant, it's too late. They have the power of the state and the military and the intelligence services and prisons, and it's awful. That's the nightmare. So what can you do? You can identify when you see someone who is looking and acting and speaking like a proto-tyrant. Now, that doesn't mean they will become a tyrant, but it means that if left unchecked, they may well consolidate power, because it does tend to be inherent in the human condition that if you allow people to accumulate more power than they need to govern, they will misuse it almost invariably.
Yeah.
So in this book, I look at the window which occurs after you see, perhaps it was a leader that you really had a lot of faith in, but you see them starting to abuse power, see them starting to do things that are undermining the whole democratic process, system, etc. And there's a window in which you and many, many like you can organize yourselves to, you don't necessarily need to abandon that leader or remove them, but you need to make them realize they cannot go in that direction and still expect you to follow them.
Mm.
And if they don't get that message, then you do find a different leader, because we can't afford to elevate people with tyrannical inclinations and let them accumulate that kind of power. And the number of examples we have are almost endless. And the harm done to humanity throughout the ages and as we speak is horrific.
Yeah. Yeah. So powerful. So, one of the ideas is there's this process that we all need to be vigilant and mindful of who around us might be a proto-tyrant. How might we break them, like BRAKE, like put some stops on them. The other key kind of conceptual framework that I think is so powerful is you talk about there being 5 concentric circles around that kind of proto-tyrant, that person. And it starts from the closest to their closest confidants, and it continues outwards to the general populace. Would love it for you to just kind of walk us through this framework of these concentric circles. And part of what your book does is people in each of these circles have specific opportunities and responsibilities. So give us kind of the overview of that framework.
Yes, that's the other contribution this book makes. In my earlier work on followership and those of other writers, thinkers on followership, we've tended to just create a duality of leaders and followers. And by the way, that doesn't mean that they're leaders and followers. It means that the same person at times leads and at times follow. But we still have made it largely a duality. And different models say that there are different characteristics, including my model, and those are helpful. But what we haven't done is put it into the context of politics. And in politics, the ability to access the leader is a crucial differentiator between what power a follower has and the nature of that power. So obviously, in the inner circle, confidants can walk into the office and, depending on their relationship, say, boss, I don't think that one's flying. I think you really better pull back on that one. Theoretically, that should be a very powerful position, but often it's not. Why? Because they are afraid to offend the dictatorial personality, and therefore they start telling them more and more of what they know they want to hear. And it's a terribly dysfunctional process, but all too common.
Yeah.
The next layer out, which again intuitively you can understand, but it hasn't been well named before, is what I call the elite circle. And elites are not just financial elites. Elites are anyone who can attract sufficient attention of both the populace and the leader to make a difference. And so therefore, the leader, the political leader, pays attention to the elites, either because they want them to support them or they're afraid that they may undermine them. As we speak right now, we've just had an example of a uber elite, Taylor Swift,
right,
throwing her hat in the ring, which takes a certain amount of courage, because I would suspect half of her fan base is voting and rooting for one end of the political spectrum, and the other end. What she did, which you and I would both identify with, she said, "This is why I'm making this choice. I'm not asking you to make that same choice. I'm asking you to do your research and think about which choice makes sense." So there she used her elite power really well, but too often elites don't, for many reasons that I go into the book, and I ask elites to examine those reasons, and I name a couple of primary errors elites make, which get them into deep trouble.
Interesting. Okay, keep going.
The third circle is, you can call it the operational circle. I call it the bureaucratic circle. No political leader can get anything done without a large bureaucracy. In the U.S., that bureaucracy is about 2 million people, and that's just at federal level, by the way. Now, there is a culture, there's law, there's protocol when you're in that circle. Per the theory of government, generally speaking, in a democratic government, we elect the political leader. The political leader sets the policy, and the bureaucracy implements. And that sounds good on paper, but it doesn't work that simply. It's far more complicated than that. And one of the ways it can get complicated is that the people in the bureaucracy develop tremendous expertise. And the people who come in, particularly in our system, and rotate in, who may never get a political appointment, but may never have had expertise in that area, give them very, very bad orders. Now there's a dilemma. What do I do? How do I deal with this? And so I go into that in significant detail, because these people, again, too often they're given a bad rap. Oh, it's a bureaucrat. But in fact, bureaucrats make an enormous difference in our lives if they do their jobs well. So, and even if you're not a bureaucrat, I think these chapters are very informative to help you understand how the bureaucracy works and how you might interface with it. The fourth circle going outward are what I call activists. Activists are people, and right now during election season in the US, we have probably hundreds of thousands of activists working on one side of the aisle or the other side of the aisle, working at national level, working at state level, working at county level. And activists obviously are a force multiplier because they are often putting their lives on hold to really put their weight for or against what they see is really important. So there are pitfalls for being an activist as well. And I again examine these and help activists think through how to minimize those pitfalls. And lastly, there's us, the populace. And the populace is, you can call it the citizenry, but in fact, the populace is everyone who can be affected by government. So there are people who are not citizens yet. There are people who are aspiring to become citizens. There are people who have lost some rights of citizenship. They're all the populace. And how, and in a democracy, of course, elected leaders pay an inordinate amount of attention to how do they get the votes of the populace. And there are a whole set of unique dynamics that occur, and both from the leader and within us and amongst us as a populace. Some of these are healthy, some of these are very problematic. And in the book, again, I raise consciousness about where am I? How am I getting my information? What am I doing with that information? And how do I make sure that I am being the most responsible citizen I can be, rather than actually being manipulated by one side or the other?
Love it. And, I have to say, each of these chapters, again, it's just so pragmatic and practical, and kind of, here's some things these folks can do that can be effective. Here's some, dangerous possibilities. Here's some traps that folks in each of these circles can fall into. And I just so appreciate the groundedness and realism.
Thank you, Max. And, I think I want to say one more thing about that, which is a lot of people listening to this podcast have an experience that I don't know if you have it. I certainly have it. Most of my friends have it. They can't talk to some of their family members.
Yeah, sure.
Thanksgiving is coming up, and we know what has to be avoided. Well, this book actually crosses that barrier. Again, I've had people on the right, on the left read it, say, wow, it may not change my mind, but it helps me think about, how am I arriving at these decisions? What do I need to be alert to? How could this actually go off the rails? And what's my responsibility? So I believe this is a book that could become almost like a book group, discussion group, particularly not just amongst your own people who think alike, but people who struggle to converse about this. At least I'm hoping that that's one of the uses of this book.
Yeah, I love it. Love it. So you've touched on it a little bit. I think many listeners, we probably fall most naturally into the populist circle. I'm sure there are some folks who are, in these other places, elites or advocates. But tell us a little bit more for the populist circle. I know you mentioned it. What should we be thinking about in that circle of influence to challenge the rise of a tyrant and to really be courageous and responsible citizens?
Here's the first thing. If you're in a dictatorship, the dictator is limiting the information and viewpoints you can get. They shut down all of the dissenting radio stations, podcasts, internet platforms, etc. Why do that to ourselves? So many of us are just listening to one side of the story. And then we think we're making up our own mind. Are we? Or are we sort of being seduced by that one side of the story? I personally, what I do is I make sure I listen to 2 or 3 different um, sources of information on different sides of the channel. It's not easy to do that. It's a little crazy making.
Yeah.
Because, it's almost like, I didn't make this up, but it's almost like, are we on the same planet? Nevertheless, we are on the same planet. And this is what the other folks are digesting or ingesting. And this is what I'm ingesting. How do I make sense of that? Can I let go a little bit of the certainty of my position and start to hear what is it in these other positions that may have some validity, so that the 80 million people on the other side of the aisle who are not stupid people, what are they ingesting that is getting them to reach this conclusion? Because if I do that, at least now I'm better equipped to have a compassionate, meaningful, educated conversation with them, rather than just be on my high horse and say, you're just stupid, you're just crazy. And that happens on both sides of the aisle. So that's the first thing that I recommend.
So I'm struck by the call to opening yourself to some uncertainty, to not believing you have the absolute truth, and to being willing to hear other perspectives, right, and take this in and really hold with empathy the different perspectives, with the fact that sometimes you have to take just incredibly courageous stands as a follower sometimes. And how do you hold that call to be with complexity and uncertainty, with the need sometimes for moral clarity?
It's hard. It's hard. Now, I need to be clear. I have my own moral clarity. And I have my own political perspectives. I am not offering them because I consider myself the steward of this book.
Mm.
And this book, I mean, sure, I could go on about what I believe is true and right and everything. So could you. So could every other person in America. That's not why you are interviewing me. Why you're interviewing me is this book is taking a different perspective. And it's saying, here are ways to think about the different inputs and pressures on you, the incentives, the channels that you are open to, the channels you're close to, the risks you're taking, and to step back and think about, perhaps very freshly, how do I do citizenship? How do I do this? And if you do it a little bit differently, a little bit more informed, a little less biased, a little more compassion, a little bit more effectively, a little bit more able to recognize and resist the proto-tyrant's progression, I've done my job.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Ira, I recognize we're kind of at our time boundary here. How can people find out more about you and more about this book?
Well, of course, you can just Google me and go to my website, and there's a lot of information on it. And some of the information will be very interesting. For example, the video when I spoke to the State Department, or to the Naval Academy, or to the British military, or to the local school. Depending on what your area of interest is, you can see how these messages pertain to that. Of course, what I hope you'll do is to look at this book. And, yes, we have 2 months left, maybe 6 weeks after this airs. I'm not sure it's going to make a huge difference to your position in this election. It might, though. But in any case, our democracy and process doesn't end on November 5th.
We hope not. Yep.
It just begins again,
Mm-hmm.
So equipping yourself to be, whatever happens, we don't even know what's going to happen on November 5th or 6th or 7th or 8th or 9th or 10th. But whatever it is, you will be better equipped to figure out how can you be present to it, how can you be effective in terms of your elected officials, and how can you engage with those in your life, your family, your community more effectively. So that's obviously what I would hope the listeners do here.
Fantastic. Well, Ira, thank you for this important and incredibly timely book. Thank you for a lifetime of work that has really been about helping us all be thoughtful and empowered and responsible, effective citizens. Just grateful for you and all that you bring to the world. And I very much hope a whole lot of people check out this book in the months and years ahead. It's a real
Thank you, Max, and thank you for being my brother in arms on this. Finding your own niche on how to make a difference in a nonpartisan way, a real difference, a material, significant difference, and more of a difference than even you've made, because you have affected the hearts and the minds of people who have a volition to do something in the world. And hopefully, with your work, hopefully with my work and other good folks' work, they will make the difference that we all crave for our society.
Amen. Amen. And I can't resist anybody who's a servant leader interested in the New Politics work, newpoliticsacademy.org. Go check that out there. And just thanks for a fantastic conversation, Ira. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Max.